Welcome back, everyone. Are you a fan of dystopian movies, books, or TV shows? Have you ever wondered what would happen if society were to collapse? If we found ourselves in some dystopian future? Would morality go out the window? Or would we still have reasons to behave ethically? That's what we're going to be talking about today, and we're going to get some help from a philosopher named Thomas Hobbes and an idea called social contract theory. Let's get started. Remember last time we were talking about human nature. Is human nature good? Is it evil? Is it something of a mix? And we looked at the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher from the 17th century, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French thinker who lived a little bit after him in the 18th century. They had very different ideas when it came to human nature. For Rousseau, our human nature is essentially good, and for Hobbes, human nature is much more selfish and egoistical. Because of these very differing views on human nature, they both saw society in a very different light. So because we are inherently selfish, Hobbes thought that society's job is to save us. For Rousseau, because we are essentially good, society can often corrupt us. So we're going to focus more on Thomas Hobbes today and look at how exactly society is supposed to save us. Hobbes provides us with a thought experiment about what it was like to be a human being thousands of years ago, perhaps even tens of thousands of years ago. He calls this time the state of nature. It's what human beings were like many, many years ago when we were hunter-gatherers, before there was a civilization, before there was society. What was it like to be a human being? And for Hobbes, it was not a very good time. It was essentially hell on earth. In his book, The Leviathan, he outlines specifically what this state of nature was like. Quote, "It was a war of all against all." He says in such condition, there's no society, and worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And probably the most famous line in Leviathan is this: "The life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I'll say that quite a bit. So to help us get a sense, to help us picture what the state of nature would be like, I want you to imagine, what would life be like without society? This is depicted over and over again in dystopian movies, TV, and literature. So if you've ever seen a show like The Walking Dead, or a movie like The Purge or Mad Max, these ideas are explained on the screen. Now it's a little bit different because in many of these dystopian scenarios, we pick up after the collapse of society, after some cataclysmic dystopian event. Of course, in The Walking Dead, there's this virus that turns us all into zombies, which has been explored again more recently in The Last of Us. In Mad Max, it's because of climate change. The world runs out of water, essentially. And in The Purge, we kind of turn society off for one day a year. So those represent collapses of society, especially The Walking Dead, The Last of Us, Mad Max. The state of nature for Hobbes, it's more, what was it like before society even existed in the first place? But whether it be Thomas Hobbes' state of nature or some dystopian future, what they have in common is that society is not there, either because it hasn't been created yet, like in the state of nature, or because it has fallen. Hobbes invites us to think about morality. Would there be any morality without society? And the short answer for him and thinkers like him is no. The foundation of right and wrong for these kinds of thinkers is society, are the rules, are the agreements that we come together and agree to either explicitly or tacitly. So for some, this is a pretty extreme view. For anyone who thinks that morality is embedded in the world somehow, or it's intrinsic to the commands that are handed down from us, perhaps from a deity, this is essentially the opposite view. So Hobbes' social contract theory, which is also known as contractarianism, denies any sort of moral objectivism or moral realism. In the Leviathan, Hobbes says, "In this war of every man against every man, nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place." So he says it pretty plainly right there that without society, in the state of nature, there is no morality. There is no justice. They don't have a place there. Now, if you're someone like Plato, or you're a moral objectivist, or you are a divine command theorist, then this wouldn't be the case. Even if there is no society, there still can be right and wrong that are grounded in something other than society. Hobbes says elsewhere, where there's no common power, there is no law. Where there is no law, no injustice. Justice and injustice are qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. So here he's echoing that same point, that if you don't have society, you don't have morality. I'll say that again. For Hobbes and for many contractarians or social contract theorists, if you don't have society, if you don't have these social agreements, you don't have morality. Do you think that's right? It's a pretty extreme view, but maybe they're onto something. So to be clear, morality is not then grounded in objective features of the world, or the divine commands of God, or even the preference of the individual. Instead, the basis of morality is the social contract, the agreement that's made between people, between humans, between rational, even if we are egoistical, even if we're self-interested, selfish people, for our mutual benefit. Now, there are some people that are sort of anarchists, maybe extreme libertarians, that are very skeptical and cynical of the government and giving up any freedoms if unnecessary. And they might be interested in the collapse of society, or they might be interested, if they had a time machine, to go back in time to Hobbes' state of nature. So it's a question that we should address. Is life better without society? If we could warp back in time and stay in the state of nature, would it be a good idea? Now, of course, Hobbes is going to say no, because people live in continual fear of death. It's war of all against all. Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But some people might disagree. Well, here are some other reasons why life in society, life in civilization, is much better than the state of nature. Yes, you do have to give up on some sort of what you might call an absolute freedom, where you can do, maybe it's not so accurate to say you could do anything, but you can at least do anything you can get away with, which is quite a lot when there's no rule of law. But notice that if we live in a pre or a post society era, There's a lot of things that we would not have. So what specifically would those be? Well, if you live in society, if you live under the umbrella of the social contract, you can have laws, you can have a constitution, you can have guaranteed rights, you can have a First Amendment, you can have, and that's freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to run for political office. You can have laws against things like murder and theft and physical assaults, and these laws can be enforced. If you go with society, then you give up some of your freedom and you allow the state to have a certain amount of power. And if we want to keep that power in check and we want to prevent it from being corrupted, but when society is functioning well, the citizens are protected. You can have a police for protection internally. You can have a military to defend against invaders from other places. You can have firefighters that come if your house catches on fire. Public goods. Think about infrastructure. Think about the electric grid. Think about sewer system, clean running water, roads, just trash and recycling services. We generate a lot of trash each day and each week, and it fills up these bins and these trash cans, and then we take it out to the curb or to the dumpster, and then once a week or so, it's like a magical truck comes around and they whisks it away. We take that for granted. You don't get that if you're in the state of nature. In society, you can have subsidized education. You can have community college. You can have public universities. You can have K through 12 education. You can have subsidized healthcare. You can have retirement programs like Social Security. Citizens in society perhaps are more motivated to be honest and decent and have integrity. If you're in the state of nature, you might throw your hands up and say, why even try to be decent? Why even try to have integrity when people will turn around, they'll pretend to be good, and then when I turn my back, I'll get stabbed in the back. And then what comes along with society is this freedom to create and pursue all the humanities, and including philosophy and religious thought and all the arts, performance arts, music, theater, dance, radio, visual arts, painting, drawing, sculpture, photography, film, television, literature, novels, poetry. And we also have more time to work on technology and the sciences. You get all that. So it's a pretty good deal. So if you are an extreme anarchist, that's food for thought. That's a lot to potentially have to give up on. So if you still aren't convinced, there's a thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma. And we're going to go over at least two versions of this prisoner's dilemma. And it's going to be an analogy. One version of the prisoner's dilemma is supposed to mirror life in the state of nature, life without society. And the second version more closely mirrors life today in society. And the outcomes of them are going to be very different. But enough preamble, let's get into this prisoner's dilemma thought experiment. So version number one, that's supposed to be like Hobbes's life in Hobbes's state of nature. There's many versions of the prisoner's dilemma, and different academic disciplines study it from different angles. So psychologists, sociologists, game theorists are interested in the prisoner's dilemma. Economists are. So it's not just studied by philosophers. The thought experiment goes something like this. Suppose that the FBI knocks on your door and they bring you in for an interrogation, and they say that you're guilty of drug trafficking. And you're like, in your head, what are they talking about? You've got the wrong person. I didn't do anything. but they arrest you, they bring you in for questioning, and they give you two options. They say you have the right to remain silent, you can say nothing, or you can testify against someone else. So it turns out that they have arrested another person. You don't even get to meet this other person. And the FBI says, if you testify that that person is the drug trafficker and not you, then the FBI will bargain with you. And it turns out that the other person is getting the same deal. They can say nothing, or they can testify against you. And so there are these four possible outcomes. You both testify against each other, you both stay quiet, or one of you testifies and the other doesn't, and vice versa. And depending on your decision and the other person's decision, that will determine whether or not you get to go free or whether or not you're going to serve some time in prison. So here are the four possible outcomes. Let's say you both testify against each other. It was them. No, it was him. It was her. If that happens, then you both are going to end up with 5 years in prison. Let's say you both decide to just sit there like, I'm not going to say anything. I don't know this other. I'm innocent. I don't know about this other person. If that happens, then you're both going to get locked up for a year, you and the other person. Let's say you think, I don't know this other person. You have no idea. You have no reason to think that they did it. You don't know anything. And so you decide to stay quiet and not testify. You might think, oh, that's the right thing to do. However, if you stay quiet and they testify against you, then you're going to get 10 years. 10 years in the slammer, let's say. And that other person is going to walk free. So that's a scary thought. And if the reverse happens, if the other person says nothing, but you rat on them or testify against them, then you get a walk and the other person gets 10 years. So you can pause the video and ask yourself, what would you do in this prisoner's dilemma? You only have two options. You can testify or stay quiet. That's it. And you know nothing. You have no relationship with the other person. You don't know anything about them. So you can pause the video and ask yourself, what would you do if you found yourself in the prisoner's dilemma? And then secondly, if you're just as selfish as possible and you don't care about anyone else other than yourself, and your only goal is to avoid jail time, then what's the right thing to do? So your two answers to those questions, they might converge, because maybe that's what you're thinking is, in this situation, I'm just going to care about myself, and of course I want to avoid jail time. So maybe you would get the same answer. So it turns out, logically, mathematically, the correct thing to do, if you're rational and self-interested and you want to avoid jail time, then you should testify against the other person. And we can actually prove this. And the way that we prove this is we consider first that the other person can only do one of two things. The other person's going to testify or not. And we're going to go down these paths, and for each path, we're going to figure out what's the best decision for us. So let's suppose that the other person is going to testify. Again, we don't know that they will, but we know that it's testify or not. Suppose that they testify. Then what's going to happen to us? Well, we're either going to get 5 years or we're going to get 10 years if they testify, depending on what we do. And if you want to avoid jail time, then you want the 5 years. So how do you get that? You have to testify back against them. So if they go down the testify path, then it would be best for you to testify. Okay, so let's lock that in. If they testify, we should testify. Now, what if they stay quiet? Then we either walk or we get 1 year in prison if they stay quiet. We either go free or we get 1 year. Now, 1 year isn't as long as 10 years or 5, but it's more than 0. So let's go for that. So we locked in that if they testify, the best thing for us to do is to testify. And also, if they stay quiet, still the best thing for us to do is to testify if we're selfish and all we care about is staying out of prison. Now, here's the irony of the prisoner's dilemma. We don't know the other person, but we can assume that they're like us. They're a human being, they're rational, they can reason out what we just reasoned out, they're self-interested, they want to avoid jail time, and so they're going to do what's best for them, which means that they're going to testify against us and we're going to testify against them. And on the matrix you can see there, that means that we're both going to end up with 5 years. And this is ironic and tragic because if we could somehow work together, we could find what works out for not just as individuals, but us as two people, as a group. And that, of course, is if we both can stay quiet. That way we minimize jail time or prison time for the group. Notice that the other 3 options, it's a combined sentence of 10 years, right? Either we both get 5, that adds up to 10. One person gets 10 and 0, that adds up to 10, and vice versa. So the way that we can minimize prison time for the group is if we both stay quiet. But we just showed logically, mathematically, that that's the incorrect strategy. So what does this have to do with Thomas Hobbes and social contract theory? Well, the issue is we have no relationship with the other person. We have no bond with them. All we know is, okay, they're a human being, but we don't know them from Adam. And that's what it's like in the state of nature. Yeah, there are other people that are your species, but they're out there in the wilds, and we don't know them at all. And so even though we might not want to hurt or harm anyone for no reason, if it comes down to us versus them, then we're probably going to go with us. And that's what happens in this prisoner's dilemma. We don't know the other person. We have no relationship with them. And here's the important thing. We can't talk to them. We can't form an agreement. If we could talk to the other person, if we could form a bond, some kind of trust, if we could agree to both stay quiet, then we would both be better off as a group. And so that's the tweak on the prisoner's dilemma. The second I said we're going to go over 2 versions. The first mirrors the state of nature, which we just finished. The second one, we lift up that veil of ignorance, if you will, and maybe it turns out the other person is our friend or our brother. And then, if that were the case, someone close to us socially, if that were the case and we were allowed to talk and communicate and bond and come to some kind of mutual agreement, then we would say, oh, okay, this is a terrible situation, but clearly, we're both going to stay quiet. And we would trust the other person because it's our friend or our brother. And then we both would serve some prison time because this is some corrupt FBI. But that's better than collectively us serving 10 years. And that's what life is like in society, not in the state of nature. In society, you can have relationships, you can have agreements, and they can be meaningful agreements because trust is established. So of course, there's always the possibility that you trust someone and they betray you, but in society, that does happen, but it's more the exception than it is the rule. So if this analogy to these 2 prisoners' dilemmas is correct, then life in society is better than life in the state of nature, because just like in the prisoner's dilemma version that's like society, we minimize pain and suffering in the form of jail time. In life, you're much better off. And just like in the state of nature version of the prisoner's dilemma, we're both suffering, we're both in prison a lot, and in the state of nature, it's the same. Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Remember earlier, I said that this social contract theory, this contractarianism, as it's also known, it rejects moral realism. And remember when we were talking about moral realism, also known as moral objectivism, one of the challenge to it is from Mackey, his argument from strangeness or queerness, that if there are these moral facts that are somehow embedded in the world, they're very spooky. They're very metaphysically and epistemologically strange. Are they supposed to be sort of like natural facts? Or are they supposed to be like truths and logic? Well, we have systems. We have a scientific method to verify natural facts or scientific facts, physical facts, chemistry facts, let's say. And we also have a method of proof in logic and mathematics to establish which theories or which statements or propositions are true and which are not. But when it comes to morality, we don't really have a method or proof, or we don't have a scientific method. And so these alleged moral facts, they're on much shakier ground. And so a lot of people move away from that really robust, deep, sort of full-blown moral objectivism. And they turn to something else. And some of the alternatives that we looked at before were too relativistic, cultural relativism or cognitive subjectivism. And they were riddled with problems. Essentially, they're too flexible and they are too tolerant. Tolerance is a good thing, but we don't have to be tolerant of everything. So social contract theory might offer us a nice balance, a middle ground between going full moral realism and going too much into relativism. So arguably, this is still a form of moral relativism, but instead of morality being relative to an individual or an individual's attitudes or beliefs or cultural moral preferences, it's relative to something deeper than that, society as a whole, and specifically the social agreements that we make, and they could be codified into law, but they also can be unspoken, that we agree to implicitly or tacitly. So it's a very attractive view for many, but of course it's not going to come without problems. So let's look at some of those. So number one here, some people, especially sort of like if you have any anarchist leanings inside of you, you might say, wait a second. You're saying I'm bound to these social rules? Why exactly? What if I don't want to be? And if we think of this like it's called social contract theory. I don't remember signing anything. So why am I bound to this? I don't even know if it exists, and who's to say that I'm committed to this? I don't buy it, some people might say. Well, the reply to that one is this idea of tacit or implied or implicit. So the social contract theorists will say, in virtue of your participation in society, that's your agreement. So you didn't sign anything, or you didn't verbally acknowledge, say at 18, I agree to all these rules of society. But just by being a citizen of the world, your behavior is tantamount to agreement. That's what they'll say. And just as an analogy to make this clear, imagine a group of children playing a game. Say it's a bunch of kids in a swimming pool and they're playing, Marco Polo or something. That game where Marco Polo, Marco, and the person who's they have to close their eyes and try to tag someone. And let's say it's a public swimming pool and kids are coming and going, and the game never really stops. Some kids leave, some kids join, and without ever being told the rules, without ever explicitly agreeing to the rules, they jump in and they play. And suppose one of these kids that jumps in joins the game without ever kind of saying, I'm in, or what are the rules? Kids do this all the time, which is kind of cool. One of these kids ends up breaking the rules and gets tagged and is the Marco person, and they end up, opening their eyes, which is against the rules. When you're the Marco, when you're shouting Marco, and then the other kids say, "Hey, what are you doing? These are the rules. You can't." The kid might try to play dumb and say, "I didn't know." But let's say the kid knows. But instead of going that route and saying, "I didn't know the rule," they just say, "Hey, I just jumped in. We never had a conversation about what the rules were. I never agreed to that." That wouldn't fly. What would the other kids? They'd say, "Well, just by joining us and joining our social thing, you implicitly, you tacitly kind of agreed to follow the rules." And I think there's something to that. So the social contract theorists will say that's the same thing. Even if the anarchist says like, "Hey, I just started to play along. I never actually agreed to this." They might have a point, but I don't know if they have two legs to stand on, because there is something to tacit agreement and how participation is tantamount to some sort of agreement. So that's an interesting reply. Okay, a couple more problems. If we are a Platonist, a moral objectivist, a divine command theorist, then we have things in the world that are objectively, intrinsically good. And so even if society got weird, societies, they can go astray. I brought up those Purge movies. I haven't even really seen them, but I assume the plot is because of this darkness, this violence inside of a lot of human beings, one day a year, we're going to legalize violent crime for 24 hours. That's why it's called the Purge, to purge that violence inside of us. And it's this cathartic experience, and then we get it out of our system, and then we can have peace and harmony for the rest of the year. It's an interesting premise, and it makes for movies that I'm sure have made hundreds of millions of dollars. And if that would be an immoral social agreement, then we're kind of stuck, because we can't say society is immoral, because society defines what is moral. So this is the same problem that cultural relativism has. If you're in the throes of a culture, you're within it, you have no grounds to say that the culture has gone morally astray. Because by definition, whatever the mainstream culture counts as moral is moral. That's just how the theory is built. There's nothing, it would be nice if there were an Archimedean point, as it were, that on which we could stand, and that could be like a moral fact, or that could be like a divine command, and say like, your society has gone sideways because it's out of alignment with the moral truth, and I'm standing on it, and you have walked away from it. If we could do that, then we would be good. But if we go with this theory, we have denied the existence of those Archimedean points. We've denied the existence of moral facts or commandments of some divine being. So there's nothing that is good in and of itself. The definition of good on this view is whatever society says is good, whatever is in accord with the social contract. Goodness is not deeper than that. Nothing is good for its own sake. So Aristotle famously wrote about things that are instrumentally good, good because they're an instrument for something else. So like a job usually is instrumentally good. especially a job that, maybe like a minimum wage job. You hate every second of it, but it still can be good instrumentally because it gets you wages or a salary that you can use to survive on, which is good. Like I'm looking at a hat. I have a hat rack near me, and I'm looking at the hats. And are hats intrinsically good? Do they have value in and of themselves? Are they good for their own sakes? I don't know about that, but they're certainly instrumentally good because they, when it's really sunny outside, they're an instrument that keeps the sun out of my eyes. So they're certainly instrumentally good. Maybe some things are both, but not if we go with this theory, says the critic. And the last problem for social contract theory, last problem for contractarians, is that if morality is tied to social agreements, and if we look at the agreements in history, they are appalling often. And we're supposed to say that this is the basis for morality, social agreements? Which social agreements? I hope you're not talking about the ones from the past, because they are discriminatory, they are biased, they are racist. There's a lot of problems with them. I mean, for perhaps the vast majority of human history, slavery was acceptable socially. And if that's the basis of morality, are we to think that, at least at that time, slavery was morally acceptable, maybe even morally good? So enter John Rawls. We don't have to ground morality in historical contracts. Instead, we can ground them in a theoretical, in an ideal. So not in a set of agreements or rules that actually exist, but ones that we strive to follow. And that's a major difference, arguably, between Hobbes's social contract theory and someone like John Rawls. So John Rawls taught at Harvard, American philosopher, 20th century, and he picked up on this idea. He was a contractarian, arguably. But the major difference between his version of this theory and Hobbes's is, in Leviathan, morality is grounded in historical agreements. But as we saw, those can be riddled with problems. They can be discriminatory and they can be biased. Just look at, so we gave the slavery example, or just, rules about who can vote. In the past, only a small segment of the population could vote. And now we look back at that and we say, oh, that was not morally good. But if that's the basis for right and wrong, we would be forced to say that it was morally good, at least morally acceptable. So you might say, oh, yeah, we can't go with actual, real, historical agreements. We have to go with theoretical, idealized ones. If we go with the Rawlsian theoretical ideal contract, so kind of the morals that a society aspire to, we avoid the problem of having a biased, discriminatory contract. However, we have a knowledge problem. We have an epistemological problem. It's not exactly clear what that contract would say. It's hard to know what the ideal social rules would look like. At least with Hobbes's real, actual, historical contracts, we know what it said. It was codified. It was documented. So there is a benefit and a challenge to both of these directions. Again, the challenge to an actual contract being the basis of morality is that it can be biased and discriminatory. Just look at the past. The benefit is we know what it says. And the benefit of going in an idealized, hypothetical direction is that we avoid the bias discrimination problem, but then we've got the epistemological problem, the knowledge problem. It's hard to say exactly what those social rules would be. What would they be? Well, John Rawls says, I've got the answer. So that's what we're going to talk about next.